She said, "We don't use brokers," and then turned into over $100,000 in profit. Let me tell you a quick story. It all started when a prospect said, "We don't use brokers." And I said, "Good, I'm glad to hear it." She was a bit confused and then said, "Why are you glad? I just told you no." That conversation started as a cold call rejection, but within 2 weeks, she gave me a test load. That load generated about $150 in profit, but eventually became a customer worth over $100,000 in gross profit. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what I said, why it worked, and how you can use the same basic approach when a shipper tells you, "We don't use brokers." But the first thing I had to understand was what her objection really meant. Because sometimes no really does mean no, and sometimes it's just an escape button. This prospect worked for a pet food company. It wasn't a referral, it wasn't a warm lead. I picked up the phone and cold called them. When she said she didn't use brokers, I could have thanked her and ended the call. That's what most brokers do, right? And that was exactly what she wanted. You see, another broker had burned her in the past. So whenever a freight broker called, she said, "We don't use brokers." The broker usually hung up and she could go back to work. That line had become her escape button. Now, sometimes a company genuinely has a policy against brokers. It's rare, but it does happen. If that's the case, respect it and move on. That wasn't the situation here. Her company could use brokers, she just didn't trust them. And honestly, after what had happened, I couldn't blame her. So I didn't need to convince her that all brokers were great. I only needed enough time to show her that we might be different. When she gave me the objection, I said, "Good, I'm glad to hear it." Then I stopped talking. That wasn't the response she expected. She was used to brokers thanking her and just hanging up. Instead, I said something that made her curious enough to ask, "Why are you glad?" Now, I wasn't trying to be clever. I was just trying to break the pattern long enough to keep the conversation alive. Then I said, "Oddly enough, several of my customers said the exact same thing when I first contacted them." Then I asked, "Do you want to know why they eventually decided to work with us?" She said, "Yeah, why?" Okay, so now for a second, think about what just happened. A few seconds earlier, she was trying to end the call. It was a hard no. Now she's asking me to explain why we were different. That hard no became a real conversation. But getting her attention wasn't enough. I still had to overcome the reason she didn't trust brokers. I explained that one of the biggest differences was accountability. A lot of brokers are easy to reach when they're trying to get your freight, but what happens after 5 o'clock? What happens on weekends? And what happens when a driver has a problem and the shipment is suddenly in trouble? That's when some brokers cut and run, and I told her that's where I shine, because I make myself accessible to my clients. If something went wrong, I wasn't going to disappear or pass the buck. But just telling her wasn't enough. Every broker says, they provide great service. So I shared a real customer story. A driver hauling a customer shipment experienced a major health issue. We had to recover the freight, arrange for a transload on the fly, and get the shipment on another truck. Despite everything that happened, the load still delivered on time. That story showed her what I meant by accountability. Then I showed her something she probably wasn't expecting. I had a testimonial from that exact customer praising us for being accessible, responsive, and accountable during the emergency. I didn't just make a claim, I gave her a real example, and then I backed it up with proof directly from the customer. That gave her a reason to believe we might actually be different, but I still didn't ask her for all her freight. I asked her for just one opportunity, one test load, that's it. She didn't have to replace her existing carriers or brokers. She didn't have to give us every lane. She didn't have to make long-term commitments. She could test us once and judge us based upon what actually happened. Within about 2 weeks of the first call, she gave us a shipment. That load generated about $1,500 in revenue and maybe about $150 in gross profit. It picked up, it delivered, and everything went smoothly. We did exactly what we promised. But getting the test load wasn't the big lesson in this story. What happened after I delivered was what turned into a long-term customer. After the load delivered, I followed up. I didn't assume she was happy just because everything looked good on my end. I asked, and she confirmed that she was satisfied with the service. Now, this is where many brokers could say, "Great, give me a call if you need anything." Then they'd hang up and wait. I didn't do that. I asked, "When's the next load on that lane shipping?" She told me it was going the following week, so I asked for it, and she gave it to me on the spot. That became another opportunity to prove ourselves. Then came another load, and another, and another. A successful test load doesn't always automatically create repeat business. You still have to follow up and ask for the next opportunity. That first load generated about $150 in profit, but eventually turned into about $20,000 a year in profit. And the relationship lasted for over 5 years. Altogether, a cold call that started with "we don't use brokers" produced over $100,000 in gross profit. And none of it would have happened if I had treated her first objection as the end of the conversation. So the next time a shipper says, "we don't use brokers," don't argue or hang up. Find out whether it's a company policy or whether another broker burned them. If it's a bad experience, explain one meaningful way you're different. Prove it with real customer story or testimonial, and ask for one opportunity to prove yourself. Not all of their freight, just one test load. Then deliver, follow up, and ask for the next one. Now, I'm going to keep it real. Not every shipper who says "we don't use brokers" will become a customer. Sometimes no really does mean no. But don't automatically assume the first objection is the real objection. In this case, one quick response earned a few more seconds. Those seconds created a conversation, and that conversation earned one test load. And that $150 profit load eventually became $100,000 in gross profit. So let me know in the comments, based on everything I just shared with you, how confident are you in handling the "we don't use brokers" objection on a scale of 1 to 10? Again, hit me up in the comments. And to make this easier, I put together a free word-for-word "we don't use brokers" script you can keep beside you when you're prospecting. Use the link in the description to download the free copy. And while you're there, make sure you join my new Freight Broker Startup Hub community on School, where you can connect with other aspiring and new brokers. Again, both links are in the description. I'll see you in the next video.